Social forces all over the world enter into the making of the products which are sent out by capitalism. And yet it has never been more private in its appropriation. Never has so much wealth been concentrated in so few hands in a system that has been globalized in its social content. And these contradictions emerge, first of all, in the center, where capital resides, where capital concentrates, and they are then exported to the rest of the third world, to the rest of the world. We only need to look at the principal indices of the crisis. One, the rate of inflation. Two, the degree of unemployment. And three, the instability of major international currencies. And you see how in each of these instances, the crisis, however great it may be, in Britain or in Germany or in the United States, is far less than the extent of the crisis in Africa and the Caribbean. That's for sure. And the central capitalist countries have some mechanisms for dealing with the problem. They establish priorities, they pass legislation, they take steps to try and cope with the three problems I've mentioned. Whereas in our economies, there is nothing but laissez-faire, because there is no power locally resident in the African and Caribbean economies to cope with these major problems. Inflation, which obviously runs at a high rate here, which is really not being curbed in any of the major capitalist countries, not even in Japan or in West Germany, is something which, when exported to the third world, means far more than it does here. Partly because the margin for survival in the third world is often so slim, and partly because of the lack of control over our indigenous economies.
Hey, comrades. So this is Nick with Comrade Carlos and Comrade Kayla. We're here to have a discussion about their worldism, talk about what that means, what it means for the West, what it means for capitalism, imperialism, how it works, and have a healthy discussion, debate, whatever you want to call it, on this topic. So I guess introducing the comrades, let's start with Comrade Carlos. Comrade Carlos, you've been very emphatic about this issue. I know you study a lot about this, you know a lot about this. So if you want to get started, to introduce yourself, introduce the topic at hand, and then Comrade Kayla can give her introductions.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Nick. I thought it'd be important and important to have a conversation about third worldism because I think it's safe to say that Anticonquista, at least the editors, though not everybody, not all the contributors and members are necessarily third worldists, but I would say the editors, we've come to the conclusion through our study that third worldism, despite its unpopularity in the Western left and particularly in the Western communist movement, it has a bad rep. It does have a bad rep. In an article that I wrote for Anticonquista recently, I tried to explain why it has a bad rep and kind of recuperate it, because I think the rep that it has is because it's for various reasons, and mainly it's to do with attributing third worldism to a small group of Western communists who are ultra left, and so some of the arguments that we're going to be putting forward today, though Kayla will probably contradict us, is that third worldism is, at least for the diaspora, for the Latin American diaspora, and we would argue for all people of the global South, as well as Black and brown communities that live in the West. Third worldism is the most advanced ideology for us, as it explains the material reality, the global economy, from our perspective, as Jose Carlos Mariátegui, the great Latin American Marxist, who's considered to be the first Latin American Marxist, said that socialism in Latin America, or Indo-America, as he would have said, has to be a heroic creation rather than a carbon copy of European socialism. And so that's kind of the spirit that we come at it from. We believe that third worldism explains the material conditions of our people. So yeah, that's what I would say to begin with.
Thanks, comrade. Comrade Kayla, how you doing? What are your thoughts on this topic? What are your thoughts? We'll get more details, but just generally an overview of your perspective, your views, your ideas. Go for it.
So what I think that, and what Comrade Carlos is probably going to talk about too, and has said before, that is true. Imperialism is a great plague. Colonialism has been a great plague to our people. There's no denying that. I think that third worldism is a deviation from Marxism. I think that Marxism-Leninism is the universal study, the science that we need to use as our school of thought to apply socialism to our own conditions. Like Mariátegui states, it is a creation by your own lived conditions. And all of us here, our conditions, though we do have our ties to our other countries, to where we come from, and we stand in solidarity with the social movements that are growing there, we also live in the West, and we need to apply Marxism-Leninism to our conditions. Imperialism and imperialism, particularly in its modern day, as Lenin said, does not change the basic contradiction that there is the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or the capitalists, that are, constantly at an antagonism, and that we need to focus on that and build socialism in our first world countries to be the ally of the third world. It is through this process, through the universal social proletarian struggle, that we uplift our class. As even let's say we build socialism here in the United States, it cannot be socialist if we continue to exploit and continue to steal from the global South. As Lenin said, no nation is free if it continues to oppress another nation. And so I sympathize a lot with the sentiments that come out of third worldism. I myself had been called out by a Venezuelan communist about a year ago, when he was like, Kayla, you sound like a third worldist. And this is when I started to think about that position a little bit, when he responded very negatively about that, because it is not something that is just accepted by the West. I mean, there are, weird Marxist groups that are like, I'm a third worldist and I'm just going to sit at home and, write all day. But look at all the popular communist parties in Latin America. None of them are third worldists. None of them hold that position. They apply Marxism-Leninism, and they stand in solidarity with the proletariat of the oppressor nation, even their own oppressor nation. And, that partially explains why Fidel Castro was such a great ally to the proletariat in the United States, advocated for our liberation. That's why Hugo Chavez sent oil and sent electricity to people in the South Bronx, workers in the South Bronx, because it is one proletarian struggle. And if we divide the proletariat, even in our own countries, we're not doing any use to our class. We're only aiding the bourgeoisie.
Thanks, Comrade Kayla. So I guess the first part of what we want to talk about here today is we want to go over a general theoretical discussion of what is third worldism and we had two ideas about it. I have my own opinions on this issue, but first I want to hear from comrades Carlos and Kayla and get their understanding of both the theoretical background of what they understand as the both what is Marxism, third worldism, or if you disagree with it, what is a more reasonable approach, I guess, to try to fill in those gaps or try to fill in that history? Is it a complete unified solidarity struggle of all workers across the globe, or does it look like something else? So, Comrade Carlos, you could start with this theoretical foundations, and then we'll go to Comrade Caleb.
Okay. All right. So I will start off by saying that third worldism, as a political concept or as a political ideology, can be traced to, the theoretical positions or the theoretical understandings. First, going back to Marx and Engels, who, as I said in my recent article, planted the seeds of something called the labor aristocracy. But actually, before I go into that, I'll just say that third worldism basically is communism. Third worldism believes in the end of capitalism, believes that the workers should be should take the means of production. It believes that we should have a communist state rather than a capitalist state. So it has all the markings of the basic communist understanding. But then where it Comrade Kayla said it deviates from Marx and Leninism, but what we think is that it adapts it to today's reality, to the conditions, and not just today, but we have theoreticians from Lenin's time till now, through the decades, explaining and trying to explain imperialism to understand capitalism and the way it's developing. And I think okay, so where we differ and where there's an argument is on the question of a labor aristocracy, which was a proposition made by Marx and then elaborated a little bit more by Engels, who said that there's a section. They observed that there was a section in the imperialist countries, namely Britain, of workers who were privileged, who, in their opinion, and through what they could see, were benefiting from the capitalist imperialist economy. And so these workers, according to them, were being bribed by the capitalist state, by the capitalists, in order to I guess, quell any any struggle, any workers' struggle, etc. And I think that particular aspect, that particular point, isn't really argued by communists in general. I think, obviously, if Marx and Lenin said it, I think most Marxists and most Marxist-Leninists would agree that that's true. That bit, that there's a section of the working class who are bribed or who are bought off by the capitalist state and by the capitalist imperialist state. So I think in that respect, there's no argument. Where there is an argument is the application of that to today. And so what we've seen in the last, in many decades, for many decades now, we've had theoreticians explaining the expansion of the labor aristocracy, not to just a small number of workers in the working class in the capitalist imperialist countries, in the imperialist countries, but an extension of these privileges, or an extension of the imperialist loot, the imperialist capture of wealth from the global south to the global north, or to the imperialist nations, and not just to benefit a few, as it's commonly said, but to benefit the whole of society. And so here we see people like Walter Rodney, Rui Mauro Marini. So these are like global South theoreticians, Marxist theoreticians, and economists who set about, and you know, this is the important part here, is that it's based on a materialist understanding, a materialist reading of the global economy. And so those communists who would argue that third worldism is based on idealism or revisionism or a misunderstanding of Marx and etc. Is, in my opinion, incorrect. When we've had theoreticians, Marxist theoreticians and economists who have shown concretely that the world economy is based on capturing the wealth of the global South, of the so-called underdeveloped nations, and transferring that wealth to the North, and not just benefiting the capitalist ruling class or the elites, or you know, the vague 1%, as we very often see in the West. There's a vague idea of this 1%, and where the 99%, we're the 99% against the 1%, and it's it's quite a simplistic way, it's quite a simplistic take of the global economy. And so what these Marxist theoreticians and economists have said and have shown and have demonstrated is that through various mechanisms, the imperialist countries loot the global South, and that same loot, through things like high wages, taxation, etc., taxing the companies and the multinationals who are in the global South, use that wealth to then extend that what's being captured to society in general, rather than just a layer or a section of the working class. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Right, and thanks, Carlos. And I think it's interesting. We should also note that these ideas of exploiting from one area, taking from one area, and bringing it back to the core is something that's rooted in Marxism, and that all Marxists should understand. Not necessarily from a third worldist perspective, but let's think about it from a very orthodox Marxist perspective. Primitive accumulation is what I'm thinking of. I think all Marxists, all of us, can agree that primitive accumulation was something that happened and occurred. Now, the question is, I guess that many people, Carlos would pose, is that primitive accumulation still occurring to this day? And is that actually making a material difference in the core? Kayla, what are I know you shared a link with me. I'll put it in the chat. So what are your more sort of theoretical backgrounds and understandings of this issue? Who are some theoreticians you go to? What are some practices that you look to? Floor is yours.
So, Carlos is, objectively right that Marx, Engels, and even Lenin wrote about the labor aristocracy, and they wrote about it as a phenomena. Why is there a privileged sector of the bourgeoisie who they at the time described as the high-level unions and, high-level machinery, productive, type of laborers. And for example, so imperialism still existed in the time of Lenin, in the time of Marx and Engels. This accumulation of wealth from the first world, from the global South, was nothing new. They studied it, and that's why they wrote about it. When they were speaking about the labor aristocracy, however, they were talking about the specific high-end, high-level union workers who were profiting off of, for example, the imperialist war that was World War I, which is why the Bolsheviks were adamantly against World War I. But this was a phenomena that doesn't mean that it's something that's integral. It is a necessary component of the class struggle, of the class contradiction. It was just a phenomena. And I think that with the heightened imperialism, with the rise of neoliberalism, particularly, I'm going to talk about my own country's conditions because that's what I know best. When you had, in the time of Reagan and Nixon, you had all these companies moving their, and you mentioned this in your article about how 84% of British workers are in the service sectors. I imagine it's very similar in the United States. I haven't really looked into it, but I imagine it's similar, where you had all these factory jobs and these, productive jobs, building machinery, building things, get outsourced into the global South. Now you have on one hand the global South with governments that are proxy governments, like the one in Colombia, the one in Peru, these proxy right-wing governments that are allowing transnational companies to come buy the land cheap, pay their workers very cheaply. And at the same time, you have workers in the United States who are now losing their jobs, losing those wealthy jobs in lowering conditions, austerity, forcing them into low-wage service sector jobs, like such as working in a restaurant or such. And so I don't see this as a benefit. I don't see imperialism as something that is a gain for the working class in the first world. I think it's the necessary contradiction that, hey, our interests are actually in line. We've lost our jobs. We've lost our good union jobs, and that was on purpose, especially in the UK. Where they had in the United States too, you had a lot really strong and popular labor movement. I mean, May Day was born in Chicago. This is where the labor history was especially strong and born out of the union struggle, where workers had a lot of power. Well, now you take away those jobs, and now you have to go focus and compete with your other workers to make $7.25 an hour, while at the same time we're taking all these tax monies and we're invading other countries in the global South, and we're further imprisoning them. We're further taking away and looting from them. Now, to the point about, looting, and it is very true that there is a lot of resources from the global South that come to the US, but I don't believe that we need imperialism to have production done in the United States. I think that socialism without stealing from the global South, socialism in this part of the world, in this region, is totally possible, but it's not to the bourgeoisie's benefit, so we don't do that. You would have to pay your workers better wages. You would have to build industry. You would have to invest, much like what China has done. They've actually put it into that because they have a socialist state. But in the United States, that doesn't benefit the bourgeoisie. It only benefits the workers, so we don't do that. We outsource. Cheaper wages, and all the profits go up to the 1%. Well, so the piece that I linked for you to put into the chat is a piece in response to Zach Cope, of many, but one of Zach Cope's claims of how most of the resources of wages in the U.S. come from the global South, and it's a response in that. So he studies labor and wages. He's a professor at the CUNY university system, the public college university system here, where he says the highest that it had ever gotten was in 2000, in a specific period. So nothing this recent, but in a specific period in 2003, the highest that wages have been able to be traced from looting from the global South in the United States was at 6%. Now, let's say we do take resources from the global South. We understand that doesn't provide value in and of itself. You also have to have the exploitation of first world workers to build the infrastructure, to build the homes, to build the buildings, to work in those companies or work in the restaurant. It is a combination of labor, of resources extracted from the global South and the exploited resources and labors from first world workers that produce more value to the bourgeoisie. So again, I disagree that imperialism is something that is of an interest for the workers here. And I think that if we're going to say stuff like imperialism and white supremacy benefits and it lifts the working class in the first world, then I just think, well, how do we then call ourselves socialists? How do we call ourselves Marxists? Don't we believe that socialism and the uniting of the proletariat would grant us far greater benefits than what capitalism-imperialism is giving us? It just sounds, and I know that you don't mean this way, Carlos, but to me it sounds very defeatist. And in a way, it would just, prompt, let's say Peru to be like, oh, well, I'm going to be imperialist, then we should be imperialist because then our living standards can get increased. No, socialism is the answer. Socialism and the universal proletarian struggle is what's going to increase all of our living standards. We don't need to be fighting for the crumbs of the imperialist loot. What we need to be fighting for is our universal benefit and to overthrow the bourgeoisie. And so you know, just the fact that, and again, I'm going to repeat Lenin, that imperialism doesn't change the primary contradictions, whether it be in Peru or it be in the United States. That is the basic antagonism of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And hyper-exploitation doesn't make a country more, you know, susceptible to revolutionary politics. I mean, unfortunately, I look at Peru right now, and I actually, you know, this study came out, it was in 2019, but as of 2019, Peru was one of the worst country with the worst income inequality. 1% of Peru owned 42% of the Peruvian economy. Okay. Now tell me why that still doesn't raise the class consciousness of Peruvian workers. There's still this George Forsyth, you know, escuálido liberal is leading in the polls when you have Veronica Mendoza, who is, you know, actually the candidate who is interested in raising Peruvian conditions, raising Peruvian autonomy, fighting imperialism, and she gets like third in the polls because it doesn't exactly raise its conditions raise consciousness. Without the existence of a vanguard party, you know, workers aren't going to just have the consciousness themselves. And so, for example, like anti-racism, right? White workers do indirectly benefit from anti-racism, but they're not going to be led there on their own. They're not going to be led to socialism on their own. That's why we Marxists have to be there in every single possible space. So to say that, well, they've historically, you know, have sided with the bourgeoisie, or, you know, they're just not as interested, they have to be led there. They have to be brought there. They have to be brought to the answer, you know, and Mao said this again, the fault, if the revolution fails to happen anywhere, it is the fault of the vanguard, not the masses.
Thanks, Kayla. And you know, it's an interesting point you bring up, and I think is one of the things specifically about Peru, the majority of the elite owning the land, being extremely wealthy, and yet there's no vanguard party or Marxist-Leninist party to lead the way. Why isn't class consciousness higher? I think this is a question we could ask for a lot of our nations, not just in Latin America, but also in Africa and Asia, and in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and US. If this concentration of capital is so strong, why isn't political consciousness raised to a higher level? So, you know, I'm gonna open this up in case any of you want to say anything else about this theoretical topic, because the next question we're going to get into is whether or not this really is this a deciding factor for Latin America, and what the Latin America diaspora follows. Is it important for the Latin America diaspora to follow or even care about this topic whatsoever? But before we get to that, Carlos, do you have anything to add or say about what Kayla said, and or about the next question if you prefer to go to that?
Yeah, for sure. I'll say, you know, I'd want to come back on some of the stuff that Kayla was saying. You know, I think just to be clear to everyone watching, I think we all agree that the end goal is the end of capitalism, and what, you know, the discussion that we're having here is about how and also examining the concrete material conditions that exist and what we can do with those conditions. Is important to understand the conditions that we're in order to kind of think about how we're going to overcome those conditions. I would say that, well, first of all, just to talk about Charles Post's position, critique of third worldism, labor aristocracy, and Zach Cope. Zach Cope is a Marxist economist who has put out you know, a lot of work and two very important books: Divided World, Divided Class, as well as The Wealth of Some Nations, where he details, and again, you know, we go back to, as Marxists, we believe in materialism. We believe in observing the world from a materialist point of view rather than an idealist point of view. So while I understand Kayla's position, I think you know, it's an idealist position to take if we're not looking at the structures of the world economy and looking and looking properly into how the global north captures wealth from the south, and much of that wealth goes into the labor aristocracy, which has been extended to much of society in the first world, the US, Europe, Australia, and so on. And so to be clear and to be concrete, we have to look at the studies of these Marxist economists. Charles Post is a he's a sociologist and a very important sociologist. But I think in order to understand the world economy, we need to look at Marxist economists who investigate the concrete configurations of the global economy. And what Zach Cope says, and his rebuttal to Charles Post, is that Charles Post proposes a few things to argue why the theory of a labor aristocracy is wrong. And so Zach Cope comes back and shows statistics and facts showing that, in fact, some of the things that Charles Post says is incorrect. Like, for example, he makes the argument, like many Western Marxists, that the reason why the West, and particularly the US, is more developed, and the reason for its higher wages are several. And one of them is, he says, skill differences and differences in productive conditions, the conditions of productivity, which is basically saying that the West is more productive than the global South. And he's saying that the Western workers are more skilled, which is quite frankly a racist and a backwards and an idealist position to take. So as Marxist, Leninist, and as materialists, I think we need to look at the concrete material configurations of the global economy. And also one other thing that Charles Post suggests is that from the 19th, not just Charles Post actually, but I think Charles Post is, the leading academic against labor aristocracy. So much of the Western left get their information from him, and especially communists get their information from him. And so they often repeat things like the conditions, the objective economic conditions of the workers in the West has been declining. Specifically in the US has been declining from the 1970s, he proposes. And Zach Cope, in his rebuttal to Charles Post, argues convincingly and using, reliable sources. So we're talking about, a material study of the situation, that in fact the conditions of the first world workers has not been declining. They have much more buying power, and I would recommend, if you want to look into the arguments, the rebuttals that Zach Cope made against Post, if Nick, if you could put that link in the chat. And it's important because it's an academic, it's an academic discussion, and it kind of, in my opinion, just basically exposes the inherent racism, the continued inherent racism in the Western left. Not just in terms of, in my article, I suggested that racism has a material base. So my argument is that racism does not just have a material base. It continues to be racist in its tropes. When it tells us that Western workers are more productive and that imperialism and kind of downplaying the importance and the centrality of imperialism, when the concrete material reality suggests something else. Another thing that I wanted to say in regards to what Kayla said about Latin American communist parties is that, she said they don't have a position, a third worldist position, and particularly a position on the labor aristocracy. That's not central to Latin American communist parties. And I agree on that particular issue on the labor aristocracy is true. I argue, and third worldists argue, that the reason why global South communist parties, Latin American communist parties in particular, have not had to extend themselves to an analysis of a labor aristocracy per se is because they don't need to differentiate between what the worker gets, what the Western worker gets, and what the Western world in general steals from Latin America and the global South. I think you can, any global South communist party who isn't staunchly anti-imperialist in their outlook and who do not champion the theoretical contributions of people like Walter Rodney, Rui Mauro Marini, and so on, which they do, in fact, they do, are not really looking at the concrete situation, the material reality of the global economy. And so I think, I would disagree with Comrade Kayla. I would say that the communist parties in Latin America in general are staunchly anti-imperialist, and they're staunchly, and they do have a position on unequal development. And they do recognize in general that the global North captures the wealth of the global South, not just through overt military operations in terms of invading our countries militarily and so on, or even sanctions, as I've been saying in the last few days, which are quite clear and overt forms of imperialism, but also in other ways that aren't too visible to the naked eye, that are difficult to decipher, are difficult to look into. And that's why we suggest reading up on people like Zach Colt, people like John Smith, people like Tony Norfield, who exposed the present day global economy and how imperialism continues to loot our countries, not just through overt imperialism, but also through economic, especially through economic and financial imperialism.
Thanks, Carlos. Kayla, do you have anything else you want to talk about in terms of theory, or also if you want to talk about what type of Marxism should the diaspora follow? I know you kind of touched on that last time, but just to continue on that topic.
Right. So, I mean, just to respond, I think that Zach Cope, again, he himself is another white Western Marxist. Isn't he from the UK? I believe. I'm not certain, but I think he's either from the UK or, the Anglo world.
Ireland.
Yeah, Ireland.
Same shit.
Well, not Anglo, actually, Ireland still. He's part of the West, right? He's another, white Western Marxist who I think that, his ultimate conclusions that the workers in the third world are, they all constitute part of the labor aristocracy. Therefore, they're not going to have an interest in overthrowing their economic mode. It is up to the third world to liberate themselves. And that way, the first world will have no one else to exploit. There will be no other countries that they can, and they will just have to rise up and overthrow their own governments. I think that is a lazy conclusion that a lot of, and we've talked about this, a lot of the ultra left here, the white ultra left here, it is a lazy position to say that, well, I can't bother organizing for Marxism here because there's just too much high standards for here. People are just too invested into the capitalist mode. And so they're just beyond reprieve. We have to wait for the third world to liberate themselves, and then we can go and do our part. And I find that to be, maybe it's not overtly racist, but it's just absolutely lazy. And it kind of replicates the same thing where you say that like the global north, or he says the global north, it lives off of the backs of the global south. Well, now you're also waiting for them to give you socialism, which I, blatantly disagree with. And so I as to the position also that the conditions for the worst first world worker are great and vast, and they're not losing their jobs. I think this is blatantly false, and I know this because I live here, I see it. I besides being among the workers and dealing with them every.
Kayla, sorry, just another point. The point wasn't that the point was that it isn't declining. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's relative exploitation. Of course, there's people being that's different. Of course, people are being exploited in the US, but we're talking about decline. There's an argument about decline in living standards, which objectively isn't true.
And that's where I disagree with. That is objectively true. More and more of our tax dollars, the ones that come from, yes, part of it comes from exploitation of the global south, and also it is mostly in conjunction with the exploitation of the first world worker, because value doesn't just come out of nowhere. Profits doesn't come out of nowhere. It also comes off of the exploitation here, which I know you agree with. We both agree that the first world worker is still exploited, and that's how the capitalists get richer off of our backs. You have in conjunction with that a declining labor rights movement that has been partially declining because you have their jobs being outsourced for cheaper and slave-like wages in the global south, and now you have workers being forced into individual and stratified spheres, that is the service sectors. Like for an example, in a restaurant, it's so hard to organize a restaurant because you got waitresses that make maybe $500 a night, and then you have the dishwashers that maybe make $20 an hour, and then you have the hostess that makes, and I know this because I worked in this restaurant, that makes $7 an hour. And there's just, this is the prime example of the service sector where everything is stratified. It's hard to have a strong labor movement. So now you have declining wages for the workers in terms of keeping in rate with inflation. Now you also have our military using more and more of our tax dollars to go and invade other countries, put in Navy warships to surround Venezuela for God knows what reason during a pandemic, while our education continues to be in decline. Workers and teachers themselves continue to get paid far, far less. Our roads aren't being built. Housing, there was a study that 45% of Americans can't afford housing and monthly rent and their own groceries, amongst all other sorts of bills. There's inflation while we've still had the same $7.25 minimum wage. So I vastly disagree. And I would like to see where he gets these numbers from, that the US worker has more buying power. Are you talking about, we have very, very wealthy people in this country. We have Jeff Bezos, we have Elon Musk, we have, these extremely wealthy millionaires and billionaires even. So when people look at, looking at GDP, that's completely not a great way to look at to determine what the average worker is making, because you have extreme poverty and then you have extreme wealth. And so what is it that the average US worker is? Well, I found that it was $31,000 a year. And so in the United States, that doesn't even make middle class. That doesn't even make what, they would define as the labor aristocracy. That's what the vast majority of workers are making, that and below. That is above the poverty line, but nowhere near what would be considered the middle class. The rich are getting richer. We're staying at a very, very stagnant rate. Our labor movement has gone down. And so I'm just ultimately, reiterating the point that the first world worker, while we might have, some benefits, and I wouldn't even consider it a benefit, it's not something like we have a choice. There's no democracy in the first world. We don't get to choose whether we want to, have socialism or capitalism. If we want to be in solidarity, we don't get that choice. The bourgeoisie makes that choice for us. They say, you're going to do this and you're going to do that, and you're not going to have proper education so you can even know what's going on in that other part of the world. You have Americans who, and I know the Brits make jokes about this all the time, the Europeans always do, Americans can't even find what this country is on a map, and that's, partially true. That's partially true, but that is for a reason. So you have a lack of class consciousness, you have a lack of education, you have poor and declining conditions happening in this country. And I just want to reiterate that this is why we would benefit from socialism. We can't pick and choose. We don't have a people's democracy to decide whether we're going to have production done here, which would actually uplift our country more than it is than we're benefiting from imperialism, or the benefit that what is coming here from imperialism is meager compared to what we can have with socialism, which is why I think that our interests are with socialism. One, get rid of imperialism. That would uplift productivity in the United States because we have the resource to do that. We have the labor power. We need to create a state that represents the workers. And we stand in solidarity with the third world into developing their own people's movements. I don't think that, being an anti-imperialist, I'm a staunch anti-imperialist. Anti-imperialism is how I became a Marxist-Leninist. I was a social democrat before. And then, I'm a part of a minority of people because most people are going to be materially interested. You need to explain to them, how materially you benefit from anti-imperialism. But I got into it just because I, studied my own history as being a Peruvian, and I thought this was absolutely disgusting. But that is like the essence of Bolshevism, as Lenin said, is anti-imperialism, is the proletarian internationalism. And so you can't be a socialist. You can't have a social state and be without it. I just want to read this Lenin quote, and I think this is going to go into the next points of what type of Marxism the Latin America should follow. And this is from Lenin. The socialists of the oppressed nations must, in particular, defend and implement the full and unconditional unity, including organizational unity of the workers of the oppressed nation and those of the oppressor nation. Without this, it is impossible to defend the independent policy of the proletariat of the other countries in the face of all manners of intrigues, treachery, and trickery on the part of the bourgeoisie. And that's why I find, the third world is, and I don't think you are at all, Carlos. I mean, I've read your work and stuff. I know, I've spoken to you, but I think that the rise of third worldism, the rise of looking more towards the third world to liberate us is part of a part of petty bourgeois radicalism. She got something to say. And so I don't think that this is the answer. Anything that, divides and stratifies the international proletarian movement, in my opinion, only aids to benefit the bourgeoisie. Is it true that a level of our existence here, perhaps, I don't know, however my building was made, maybe it came from some sand in Costa Rica. That is an objective fact. But did it need to? I think that our standards would be heightened without imperialism. I think that our lives would be better without imperialism, both here in the first world and in the third world. And that is why together we both have the interest to overthrow it. And the workers are not going to come to that conclusion themselves. They don't even know how we're getting our buildings to be made. That's why we have to be there among them. And we can't be there among them and say, well, you're part of the labor aristocracy and you are in collaboration with the bourgeoisie. No, we have to be there among them and show them why socialism is the answer. Because again, as Mao said, when revolution fails, it is on the vanguard and not the masses.
Yeah, I'd like to say,
Yeah, go for it.
Again, yeah, like, we don't disagree. We all want socialism and it's true, and we agree. And I think a misconception, and I think a bit of a straw man argument against labor, the theory of a labor aristocracy has been that it's defeatist and so on, but no, I would argue that you're right. I think in general, as socialists, we believe that the whole world will benefit from a socialist society and eventually a communist society. We agree on that, but again, from a materialist point of view, we can't deny the fact that as the global economy is at the moment, there is imperialism reconfigures class. Imperialism reconfigures class. So that means that because of the material privilege bestowed upon the first world worker, there is a disinterest, and I don't think that's an idealist thing to say. I think that's a thing that you could look not just in terms of history where the revolutions have happened, but also in today's climate as well, where the more radical revolutionary movements are happening, are not in the global north. I'd also want to say a few things. The other thing that I wanted to say as well, to do with that, is that it's commonly said that third worlders don't believe in who are defeatists, and they think basically that the Western working class and the white working class in particular should just they don't have a role. And that's false. We as revolutionaries, as Marxists, we work with anybody who wants to end the capitalist imperialist system. The issue is, will they work with us? And the issue is about looking at the objective situation. And I think, Kayla, you said that, you question, for example, what Zach Cope says in his work, that standard of living in the West is not declining. And I would, you were asking where he got that in particular, and he gets it from two economists, Mayer and Sullivan, who wrote a paper in 2011 explaining exactly how the standard of living, so for example, they say things like basic food stuff, the basic food stuff in the household. So they say that since, Pohl says that it's been declining since the 1970s, and Mayer and Sullivan say that, in fact, nowadays it takes 26% less of a worker's time to be able to buy the basic foodstuffs for somebody's house. So, that's a material privilege that the majority of the world doesn't have, and that the first world does have. Stability in material goods, and especially in foodstuff. So, and that's just one way of calculating the current state of the workers' living conditions in the first world. Another thing is that it's not just about wages either, and I think Pohl says this too, that it can't just be about wages. So you said something about the average income being $30,000 a year, which is quite low, and you say just above the poverty line. But the thing is that it's not just about the wages; it's about other things too. Imperialist wealth seeps into things like welfare, infrastructure, public services, security of employment, etc. So all these things that the global South, all these benefits, material benefits that the global South doesn't have, and they don't have it because of imperialism. And the first world workers do have that security, that very real, concrete, material security. And that's not to say, and it's not to deny, as I said in the article, it's not to say that we don't think that first world workers in general aren't exploited. They are exploited, but it just means that they also receive wages that don't represent necessarily what they've produced, and it also means that that basically first world workers basically that first world workers. Sorry, I lost my train of thought and this computer's messing up. Yeah, basically my general point is that first world workers continue to have a higher wage compared to the rest of the global south, and it isn't of their own making. And that's important because it means, as Zach Cope and other current Marxist economists argue, the material interests that the first world working classes, specifically the white working class, have in the global economy means that they are dissuaded from revolution, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we're defeatist and we say, you know, the white workers can go over there and we're going to organize amongst ourselves only. No, as I've said and as I've responded to some of the people on Twitter that have responded to what I've said, we're open to working with anyone, and especially if you're a Marxist and if you're a communist, then of course we're open to working, and if you're a Marxist and a communist, you should care about imperialism, and you should, and if you understand the global economy, then internationalism should be a priority rather than a secondary thing as it is currently in the first world workers movement.
Thanks, comrade. And I want to give a shout out real quick to all the folks who are following us on chat. We got a lot of viewers. Shout out to Ewoks, Red Chilean, Didier Ortiz, Neo the Awakened, Den's Name, Red Lettuce I saw on here. Chris runs this. You know, shout out to everyone who's following us and been sticking with us throughout this whole discussion, debate. You know, I think at the end of the day, it's about solidarity. See, we're showing that. I think here that what this shows right here is that we can have these debates and these discussions, and they don't have to be antagonistic. And I know if you look on Twitter, it's all about antagonism. It's all about contradiction. It's all about people trying to end this sort of solidarity. And so, you know, I'm trying to be as neutral as possible. I saw some people wanted my opinion on this, and you know, maybe I could give one later or what. It's up to the comrades here on the video too. But Comrade Kayla, you have anything else to say about what Carlos said? Anything else about, you know, what you think about this topic, or even some of
Of course he does.
Yeah, of course
he does.
But anything else about some of the things too? We wanted to get into some of the discussions that we were seeing pop up on Twitter and on social media. So if you have anything to talk about those things, you know, go for it.
Right. So here's just the one thing. We got to be consistent about this. Is it the first world workers that are all part of the labor aristocracy, or are we going to say it's just the white first world workers? Because using, you know, the same, you know, instances that you prove, it's not only wages, but it's also how your welfare is distributed. I mean, the welfare, the way that it's produced in our country here, it comes through taxes. And, you know, I think you're underestimating the profits that the U.S. workers' labor produces, in conjunction, of course, with resources from the third world. But there's also a great level of their labor that's being exploited, that produces rich companies like Amazon, or even rich restaurants like that I worked at, like Veselka. I mean, I don't really see how Veselka itself is a product of, you know, a worker in a restaurant, in a mom and pop restaurant is the product of imperialism, but I digress. You know, then that would encompass all workers in the first world, not just white workers, but all workers are, you know, profiting from, whether it's buying an avocado that happened because of NAFTA, which was also, you know, protested a lot by U.S. workers and farmers and Mexican farmers, because it was something that really plummeted both of our countries' labor movement. Or it could be something like, you know, whether you collect food stamps or whatever have you, that is also produced by our labor, which steadily gets cut and cut and cut. More of our tax dollars that come from our labor is getting pushed towards the military. It's not going to our education. Less and less are going to our Medicare, Medicaid, actual health care that most Americans can't afford. I mean, I know that social democracy has extended the life of capitalism in Europe. I think that you guys will follow behind us, but I completely disagree that there's, the conditions of the U.S. workers heightened. If anything, it's declined. You could look at just by rents have been going up while wages have remained mostly stagnant in comparison to the costs of living, which is why that you see in our country, particularly, more people leaving liberalism, leaving liberal capitalism, and looking either to the right or to the left, because our conditions are in decline, because people understand that liberal capitalism has nothing to offer us anymore. The debt of student loans in this country has increased. And you don't have this in your country, but we have this in our country, where the poor are, if you're poor and you have a poor credit, that prevents you from getting a job, that prevents you from getting housing, that prevents you from getting literally anything. Like, I can't leave my apartment because I, missed some student loan payments when I was only gone from school for a year. I've had to take 2 years off of school just to work. And this is not something that's found in a lot of Europe. I had an Eastern European person told me once, I can tell you're American because you're so impressed by free education and free free healthcare. And yes, it is very impressive to me. But, to say that, the workers in the US are privileged because you have things like welfare, or you have things like, affordable housing programs, these things don't exist in the global South. I mean, then you would, if you were applying those same conditions, then we can apply them to the women in Argentina who just won the right to not only abortion, but free abortion, while you got girls in Alabama using the, hanger still to this day. It's just, quite unfortunate. Or we could talk about like the position that Chilean people have. The Chilean people have, not exactly the same wages, or not exactly the same heightened development, but they have a lot of programs that we don't even have here. And, Chile is a horrible capitalist bourgeois dictatorship regime. And then to say that, the first world workers don't really, it is more difficult for them to see that they have an interest in fighting against imperialism. I mean, why then do we make the distinction between then just first world and third world? Why not also the distinction of, or even just white and black workers, how they don't have the same interests? Why not also make the distinction of men and women? Men don't have the interest in socialism because they make more money. Worldwide, they make more money than women. Worldwide, they're more benefited by patriarchy, right? And that's not true.
White men. White men, maybe.
White men, but all men in all different demographics compared to their women of their same demographic, make more. They have a better standard. They have a better employments, better opportunities than women globally, even in their own demographics. But that's not true. That's not true. Men will still benefit from overthrowing the patriarchy. Men will still benefit from, women's liberation. And we need men. We need men to overthrow this state. We need all class solidarity, all class, struggle together. It is, at the end of the day, it is the same struggle. Yes, nobody is saying that we need to ignore imperialism. That's, like I said, I'm going to reiterate, if you are ignoring imperialism, then as Lenin would call you, you are a social chauvinist, a socialist in thought, but a chauvinist in deed. You can't do that. But that doesn't mean that we need to, say that or think that workers in the first world are not, capable or don't have an interest. And that's the bottom line. That is my biggest disagreement with third worldism. I have no problem with the solidarity of the third. Absolutely not. That is necessary. That is an integral part of proletarian internationalism. But my disagreement, my biggest strife with it is that it seeks to say that the first world worker, and under this presumed idea of a materialist analysis, that the first world worker wouldn't benefit from abolishing imperialism, that the first world worker will continue to be chauvinist. I gotta disagree with that. I just, that is where you miss me with, because I hear myself in New York City. I've seen Ashkenazi Jewish tenants stand up in the court and scream about how the rich in the city are stealing from us. They're trying to kick us out. They're always taking from the poor. And I've had to tell Guyanese landlords, no, you can't call ICE on your tenant just for not paying rent. I think that at the end of the day, it is the proletarian struggle. At the end of the day, it is an international proletarian struggle, and we need to stick together. We need to stand in solidarity. We need to support the Global South movements. And also that the reason why this line, the third worldist line, is rejected in the third world, because you could see that none of the popular parties down there purport this. And you say that it's because they don't have to, but I think it's because they don't believe in it. Because in action, in every single way in action, they support socialism in the United States. They support the working class working together to overthrow, the regime that is also oppressing us and oppressing them, because it is in their interest. It is their interest for us to build socialism, just as it is, for them to build socialism is part of our interest, and that we need to stand together, because at the end of the day, it is going to uplift our class. And I just, like I said, Stalin, Lenin, they all believed in this. Che Guevara said, the first world communist, he was jealous of the first world communist. And I always say this is the first video that I saw by Anticonquista that made me go, I cried, but I'm a big baby. He was jealous of the first world communists because we have the ability to fight the empire within the belly of the beast. And how do we do that? By building socialism, not, destroy America, death to America. Okay. But what then? What are we going to build? What are we going to create? What is it that we want to aim to do? And I don't think that is idealist. I think that is a winning message. I think that is the way that we are going to get our class to see how they have an interest in socialism, how they have an interest in anti-imperialism. And I think that if we do this correctly, they already know it. It is my belief that we do not have an interest in imperialism. In fact, it is hurting us more than it helps us. Right? We could have much more if we did without than we get when we have it in. And again, we don't have a choice. We're talking about workers who don't even understand their own dynamic to their own boss. Many of them still take in the bourgeois' interest and think it applies to themselves. And yet we expect them to understand why. And because, again, that is my fundamental disagreement with the third worldist conclusion, is that not that imperialism isn't a great part of the capitalist profit, but it's that the first world worker has an interest in maintaining imperialism. And I disagree with that. I think our interests are not the capitalist interests. And I don't think that the proletariat is at fault for the crimes of the capitalists. Now, that doesn't mean the proletariat of the oppressor nation is hands-free and clean-free. Absolutely not. We know that a lot of them have reactionary sentiments, whether it be racism or sexism or xenophobia. But we're taking in what's that word? We're taking in the sentiments that the bourgeoisie is giving us and reiterating them back to them. Because while it's true, we do have to compete with each other as workers, we have much more to gain than we stand in solidarity. And I don't think that is idealist to say that white people, you benefit from anti-racism more than you benefit from racism. Or men, you benefit from patriarchy more. You benefit from anti-patriarchy than you do benefit from the patriarchy. And that is my, I'm just going to reiterate that. That is my bottom line conclusion, that as to stick to the Marxist-Leninist principles, that part of Marxist-Leninism is internationalism, but it is also to apply our material conditions to our countries, the ones that we live in. And the best thing that we can do for the third world is to fight for socialism here in the belly of the beast. In the same way, like Lenin said, the worker of the oppressor nation cannot be free if it is oppressing another nation.
Just quickly,
ahead,
Nick, a few things. A few things. I think, first of all, I think we need to, one of the things that third worlders say is that Western communists, and I think Comrade Kayla shows, she's talking about America. Like, we need to think about America and like our country. We need to build socialism in our country, but we need to look at the global economy. We need to look at it as a whole. We need to think about our class, not just in terms of our class in the particular society we live in, but our class in the global economy as a whole. Comrade Kayla said a few things. She said, you said, particularly white workers, and I think this is important, and this is actually what this conversation is supposed to be about. The white workers in particular. You know, it's you said that we need to overcome like racial barriers. We need white people and white workers to understand that they gain more from anti-racism than racism. We need men to understand that we would benefit more from anti-patriarchy, etc. And that is all true. You know, as a principle, it's true. As an objective reality, if we apply a material analysis to it, it's difficult, it's complicated, it's an ideal, and an ideal in a good sense. Like, it's an ideal as in that's what we want. We want a society that isn't racialized. We want a society that isn't sexist and classist, etc. But the reality, we do have to look at the way society is built materially, and the reality is that white workers, this, I don't think anybody argues with the fact that white workers, white people in general in the United States and in the world have the highest wages, concretely, materially. So, and that's not to say that some white workers, aren't poor and aren't oppressed and exploited. But we're talking about, if we look at it from a global point of view, white people and white men, or white people in general, and including white workers, on average have higher wages than Black, Latin Americans, and other ethnicities in general. So whilst we agree with the sentiment, we agree, of course, in principle, that we shouldn't divide ourselves in terms of race, we do have to look at the class configuration and race plays a big part in that. You know, we can't separate race from class, and I think that's where our analysis has to include our own global South thinkers like Mariátegui, who centered rightly, who centered the indigenous population because he saw that, well, first of all, they were the majority, but also because they were the most oppressed in Peruvian society. So, and it's the same thing, you know, that has to be applied across the whole world. We can't just have, we've been called, or I've been called, or we've been called in general, third worldist, radlibs by white communists for expressing the fact that the concrete fact that white workers on average have higher salaries than us. Just for expressing that, we were denounced by white communists. So I think that says a lot. And the other points that I wanted to make, Comrade Kayla talked about taxes and paying for those, the welfare that I was talking about that is tied to imperialism. You mentioned taxes as paying for them, or at least paying for some of it. But as I showed in my article, here in the UK, for example, the NHS is supposedly also paid for by our taxes. It's free at the point of service, but we pay for the NHS through our taxes. But again, where do those taxes come from? You know, where do our work? Where does our wages? Where do our wages? How are our wages propped up? Why are British wages so high when Britain is so unproductive materially? If 80% or 84% of the British workers work in the service industry, and that means that they're not really doing productive jobs, it means there's an imbalance in this economy. It means that, you know, where is this wealth? Where is the actual concrete material wealth? The goods, the consumables, manufactured goods and so on, the primary resources, where is that all coming from? How can we consume? How are we one of the, I say we, but I consider myself Colombian, not British. I live here. I was exiled from my country. How does this country have this standard of living? It's not based on the productiveness of British workers and white workers. It's based on the looting of our people. And directly, just to give a concrete example as well, and I guess a personal example, as a Colombian, it's quite difficult to trace or to understand why why Colombia is in the situation it's in. Why do our people have to flee the country either for economic or for political reasons? And it's not an internal problem. The root causes of the conflict in Colombia is not an internal problem. It's a problem of the global economy and the pressures it puts on our people and the violence, the capitalist imperialist violence and so the concrete example I want to give is that Britain has played a big part, and it's not known by Colombians because we focus on the US, because the US does the overt imperialism where it invades us militarily with bases and so on. But in fact, the British, the Europeans, and the European Union in general have a relationship with Colombia in which they basically loot our country. We're basically producing for them while our people and they're capturing the wealth of our nation through various means while our people suffer poverty and creates the unstable conditions we live in. And Britain has played a big role in terms of multinational trade, as well as funding the Colombian military and all these other ways to oppress our people. And so it would be a mistake. It would be a mistake for us to think that just because we live in this country and pay taxes, that we have to be grateful for the NHS and for the National Health Service and for education and for the public services that we have here, when really it's been looted from us. And so that's the position of that's not just the position of the third worldists per se. It's a position of the global South revolutionaries, from the last century. You Comrade Kayla mentioned Che Guevara, saying that he was jealous of the First World, but I think it's a misreading of what he was saying. In fact, what he was saying was he's jealous, but he's jealous not because of productivity or because there's an organic. Sorry, this computer is messing up with me. Because there's an organic production of wealth, but there's a quote here where Che Guevara says he's being interviewed in Italy, and the interviewer says to him, the European working class isn't interested in this talk about sacrifice or in this association with socialism with sacrifice and voluntary work. They are interested in cars and TVs and higher wages. They support the party because it leads the fight for higher wages, and they have a right to want this. And Che Guevara responds by saying, I'm very happy for the European working class with their high wages, but don't forget who's paying for those wages. We are millions of exploited workers and peasants in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And so, as I was saying before, I think that just because the revolutionaries, the communists, the Marxists, and the global South haven't extended themselves on the question I guess it's a question of studying. It's quite an intellectual, academic study of the labor aristocracy and all of its configurations, they haven't. But because they haven't had to, because they understand at a general level that the North, the global North, the capitalist core, the first world nations captures the wealth of our people to better the living conditions of the people in the global North. And then just to end, sorry, and then maybe we can move on to the other things. Or I'm sure Kelly would want to respond to what I'm saying. What was I going to say? No, damn, I forgot what I was going to say. All right, go ahead.
I just want to butt in real quick, Comrade Carlos. I think, he made some good points. One of the things I want to talk about, though, because this was really bothering me when this sort of discussion was occurring online and I was seeing what other people were saying, was this discussion of racism when it comes to imperialism, third worldism, and colonialism. I don't believe this. I know that it is true that racism is a institution that exists for the benefit of the white workers, of white supremacists, of the white nationalists. Racism has a material interest, right? There are material interests in racism. There are material interests in a division based on ethnicities, which has existed within in not only the United States, but all throughout imperial empires for centuries now. And we've seen this. We've seen how this has played out. We've seen mass lynchings of Black folks, which is carried out by poor white folks. And this is an unfortunate history, but it is the history that has occurred. Comrade Kayla will be right back, guys. She had to run to the bathroom. But as I was saying, we have seen poor white folks not only lynch Black folks, but also lynch Indigenous and Latino folks. There was a reality of a working class white population, and I really don't know too much about the history of Britain, but I do know about the history of the United States, that has worked adamantly against the interests of Black, Latino, Indigenous, and Asian folks, the colonized, the internal colonies, as we would call them here in the first world. I've seen, for instance, let's talk about William Z. Foster and his, one of the things he talks about early on in the 1920s in his labor movement is the occurrence of Black strikebreakers. So, Foster, in trying to unify the working industrial workers movement in the United States, he says, well, there's an issue where Black strikebreakers are coming in and breaking the strikes of white industrial workers, and we need to overcome this by making these Black folks realize that they're being manipulated and used by the bosses, by the capitalists, and we need to unify them with white workers. Now, the biggest problem here in Foster's analysis is that a lot of it was based on false narratives, fictional stories. There were fictional stories running around at the time of the 1890s, 1900s, 10s, and 20s, which were fictional stories created by conservative union leaders, which were telling these mostly white unions, almost entirely white unions, because a lot of them were segregated, and telling Euro-American workers that, well, Black people are being sent into your areas to take your coal mining jobs as you're on strike. And the reason, now we have to understand, why were these white workers on strike? Well, they're on strike because their wages were being decreased, right? And so the idea was, well, these Black folks are being sent and taking our jobs. In reality, that wasn't actually happening. That wasn't happening, but it was a narrative being used by even the most radical leftist organizations, members, people who would later become part of the CPUSA. These were being used, these false narratives were being used in order to justify something that just wasn't the case. And what it did was it created these racial and ethnic tensions that need not exist in the first place, but were really part of a centuries-long legacy. And I'll share a link with you all on this topic of these false narratives of Black strikebreakers, because this really kind of feeds into a longer history of what what racism has provided to certain peoples in certain in the United States in terms of material benefits, right? What racism has actually provided, because there is, if you really want to defeat racism, if you really want to talk about these institutions, you first have to acknowledge the fact that people don't believe in racism because they are, it's not that people are brainwashed, right? People aren't propagandized, right? There are material benefits to this type of stuff. There is just like there's a material benefit to patriarchy. There is a material benefit for the man when the woman has absolutely no economic independence, right? That leaves more economic opportunities for men. The same is true for white and blacks, or white and Latinos, or Asians, or indigenous folks, right? When you go to a country and the first thing that a white settler is offered is 40 acres of land versus an enslaved African coming to the country and being offered lifetime of indentured servitude, you know, that is a form of generational wealth, which is going to carry down for many, many years. And it's going to affect how these two races have these social relations together. That is the material interest in racism. And so I had, reading.
And that's sorry, Nick.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nick. And just to butt in quickly there. And that's why, like, for example, measuring by just the wage average a year isn't enough either, because it doesn't take into account this wealth that has continued. It doesn't take into account savings. It doesn't, for example, retired old white people who have, hundreds of thousands in savings and who don't have an income. It doesn't take them into account. So yeah, it's.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, too, we could point to 100 different examples. Crack versus cocaine. Which one is penalized more, and why do you think it is? Right? Because one exists in the black community, one exists in the white community. It's funny because, look, there are a lot of things that white people, especially poor white people, do suffer from. But notice how that gets perceived and played out in the media. The opioid crisis is suddenly a major problem. I lost one of my close friends to the opioid crisis, right? But why is the opioid crisis now one of the major headlines in the United States? Because it's a crisis in white communities. The crack epidemic wasn't a crisis in the white community, so that was, mostly overlooked. And not many people cared about it. Very few people even fought against it. And we can talk about all kinds of drugs that oftentimes get ignored but do exist in certain communities. Methamphetamine is a big drug in Latino communities, especially down south near the border. But that doesn't get addressed nearly as much as opioid crisis. And a lot of the people who are poor, who do get arrested for that kind of stuff, will get penalized more so than someone who is middle class or upper class. Or even if you're comparing, for example, a poor white person versus a poor black person, they'll get two different types of penalties. That is a material difference in race, right? Based off of race and ethnicity, which is extremely important to highlight and not overlook, because you cannot win over these communities by ignoring the fact that their plights, and they're just based on their skin color, they are going to receive less opportunities. They're going to receive less advantages in life. So I really wanted to stress that, because we are not a colorblind organization. I'll say that objectively. And I don't think anyone on here is colorblind or believes in that sort of theory. But we don't want to mistakenly push that line. Or have our followers.
I do think like the conversations we've been having on Twitter, I do think that there is a tendency in the white communist movement to underplay race.
Yes.
And go for the universal working class. Like, it's that race at best is just a social construct. Something that divides the worker. It can be educated out of the minds of the workers. But so by saying that, then you're ignoring the material realities of race, the realities of black and brown people. And that's also part of the problem. We center as communists, if we don't have a perspective on race, which the third worldist position does. If you don't center race in, at this simultaneous problem with class, then there's a problem. There's a big problem.
Right. Kayla, do you want to have the last word? We're about at the 1.5 hour time mark. I don't want to take up too much of y'all's time. I know it's pretty late for you, Carlos. Yeah,
I don't mind going on.
Definitely.
We could do one of those YouTubes of the other lefty communists where they go for like 5 hours.
Yeah, 5 hours.
Well, what I'll say is that, I'm just going to start off, break it down to basic Marxist theory. Class is the base. The class system that we live in is capitalism. It is the base. The basic contradiction, first contradiction in this class is the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And then we have the superstructure, and this includes things like race, it includes gender, it includes religion and, immigration, all sorts of these aspects. And I hear a phrase a lot that's like racialized capitalism. And I think that, because the foundation that in this country that was able to build capitalism was colonialism. And how did that happen? It happened through our countries and all of the Americas. And let's be clear on that. United States is not unique. Canada's not unique. Peru did the same thing. Cuba did the same thing. Venezuela did the same thing. They all had an enslaved, and some countries, Cuba proportionally more than others, they had slaves. They had, decimated and killed indigenous people and threw them to the side. And they had, the majority of the upper class was white, not majority of workers. The majority of white people were not of the upper class, but the majority of the upper class were white. And I think that's what we're getting to here. But of course, yes, white people, because of that, have far been able to have more access to opportunities, and therefore intergenerational wealth gets spread through for some. The vast majority, I think, in the Anglo-Saxon world, it kind of gets a little iffy when you talk about other immigrants because, the way Europeans are, but whatever. So the way I see it, the way that it's been since the past 20 years is that we see because at the end of the day, the superstructure maintains the class system, and the class system shapes the way that the superstructure is run. So we've seen to this day, we have in the United States a vice president who is a black woman who locks up other black women. Well, we had a black president in the United States. We've seen that to maintain the class system, with the rise of social justice movements, with the rise of people wanting that to feel represented, to want equality among race, among gender, we've seen the bourgeoisie say, "Hey, we have a serious problem here," because it's true. The majority of more white people have more wealth than black workers. We need to concede on some things. If we're going to maintain the class system that we have today, it has to be diverse. So that's why NATO is like, all right, we're going to be diverse. We're going to diversify our imperialism. And the bourgeoisie is like, all right, we're going to let more women are going to be, the heads of CEOs. We're going to allow more black people to become, war criminals as well. And this is all in essence to maintain the same, maintain the class system that is capitalism. Now, as to the whole idea of, white workers are inherently, or maybe, I don't know if you were trying to argue that, but white workers being reactionary. Well, I don't know if the black strike working thing is certain or true or not. I do know that did happen in the West when they were sent, manifest destiny workers go out to the West, go out there and colonize and make the West not Mexican, but make it white. And they were settling over there. That they saw the Latin American wage workers who started coming over from Latin American capitalists and Chinese capitalists who were bringing over Chinese wage workers, wage laborers. White workers were seeing that if we strike, if we resist, now they're bringing in these other minorities, and that fueled xenophobia. They viewed their fellow worker as competition because, that's what capitalism does. It forces workers to compete with each other, but they were competing among ethnic lines, right? Well, we're better. We have the right to be here because we're white, and this is our country, and this said that we're allowed to be here. That is something that the bourgeoisie told them. This is your inherent right as a white worker, and we need to kick out those foreign capitalists who are bringing them over and trying to, profit from the gold rush. there's actual, and not to deny, to say that, oh, well, this is just, something that people are brainwashed with. I do agree that there is not so apparently a direct and immediate benefit to white people in anti-racism, so they don't directly see how does it benefit me. In fact, if you talk to a lot of white people about, Black civil rights, maybe in the 1960s or today, they see it as an infringement upon their rights, or like, oh, Black Lives Matter. Does that mean that my life doesn't matter? But it's because capitalism forces workers to view each other as class enemies. And, the same thing can be said of Latino mestizos to Black people, or within the Black community. There is colorism. This is not something that's just unique to the United States. This happened all over Latin America, and still socialist movements were able to prevail outside of that. Cuba, who led the revolution in Cuba, was a freaking white petite bourgeois landowner guy, Fidel Castro and Raúl Castro. They were not proletarians. They were not, of the slave class. He was a lawyer. His dad was a Spanish landowner, but he betrayed his class. He organized the white workers, the Black workers, the peasants to rise up and unite for socialism, because even though they were backwards, even though they harbored a lot of reactionary views, they still had more to gain from socialism than they did without. All right, maybe we can argue first that the first movement in Cuba was a national movement, not so much a class unit. They were trying to overthrow the U.S. capitalists. Okay, we look to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, Russia, has over 100 ethnicities, just Russia alone. But they were an empire. They had, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, who were not considered, on the same level as a Russian. But the Bolsheviks were able to unite all these different nationalities that had been historically oppressed by the Russian. And this was one of my favorite pieces about Lenin, is Lenin on the National Question, where he says, the proletarian of the bigger nation, of the great nation, needs to earn the trust of the worker of the smaller nation, right? It's not like you can just demand it and you can just expect it. And that's why, in the Party of Communists, you have white workers, or even, for example, men workers. They went to the Planned Parenthood and stood outside with, fighting against those wackos with you kill your baby, you're evil. They were fighting against them to show their solidarity with women. That you need to do that. You are expected to do that. White workers in the socialist movement will always be expected to do that. They don't get a pass to be racist just because, we're going to organize on our class lines. But that doesn't mean that, the contradictions have changed just because they make higher wages, or that they're less proletarian. They're not any less proletarian, and they do have a benefit into fighting racism, because we could have so much more. This is, again, where I don't say, is this a benefit? Because we're settling for crumbs. They're settling for crumbs. We're all settling for crumbs and competing with each other under capitalism, whether it be men who we could say benefit from patriarchy, but do they really, in the long run, is that really a benefit? And I think that this is important because we see the bourgeoisie has transnational, transracial class solidarity. That's why you see the Arab bourgeoisie working with the Israeli bourgeoisie. They don't care about their people. They don't care. The Colombian bourgeoisie doesn't care about Colombians. They care about themselves. They care about their own class. So they work along their own class interests. That's, the Latino bourgeoisie who's risen in Miami, or I actually have a personal story. My aunt and her husband, native people from Peru, immigrants, came here, not very legally, and they got very wealthy. Not illegally. They got wealthy. They supply now a business to Disney and to whatever other companies down there. They don't care about Latino people. They say, they should stay on the other side of the border. Why they're in concentration camps? Oh, they shouldn't have crossed here. Because they are organizing on their class, because they stand aligned on their class. That's how they maintain their class power. And so we need to, if we're going to win anybody to the proletarian struggle, it needs to be anti-racist, anti-imperialist. It needs to, put an emphasis on women's and non-men's liberation. But we can't let that confuse our class lines. We can't say that now our class lines have changed because there are some divisions within the working class. No, we all still have the same interests, and we need to highlight that, while we also need to highlight each other's struggles. White workers do need to stand in solidarity with non-white workers. Non-men Men need to stand in solidarity with non-men because it is all for our own mutual benefit. It is all for our mutual benefit. And so, again, I don't mean to argue to say that, like, oh, well, white workers are not, are just pure and they can do no wrong. But it's to say, let's not confuse the class line. Let's not confuse and not put an emphasis on class. And let's also remember that race, gender, all these other things are the superstructure. And if we organize on that only, that's how the bourgeoisie gets us back into the same class system. They will change. They will change.
But nobody's saying that, Kayla.
No, but people do. People do, and so we need to be clear. People do.
But it's communist.
Let Kayla finish real quick.
Yeah,
there are communists who do say that, who will say, well, race first, everything else comes second, or race and class are the same thing. Well, then gender's the same thing as class. Gender's the same thing as race. Why? I mean, again, and this is something very unique to these days. Women were the first class. Why is it that there's an exception for this and not an exception for that? I don't get it.
Okay, Carlos, you can go ahead.
No, yeah, I just wanted to say, like, to be sure and to be clear, and so people know, we don't argue, and actually that's one of the things that we get accused of when we talk about third worldism, is that we focus on things like race more than class or whatever, which is not true. We just understand that, as Marxists, as materialists, and I think, as non-white Marxists, is important to us because it's a reality to us. Of course, white communists are not going to, feel like the race is a major contradiction, and something that should be fought. One of the things, one of the white communists who was arguing against the points that were being made on Twitter said something like, that we were pushing identity politics and that we were radlibs or whatever, because we're talking about because we were exploring and we're studying, and not just in terms of theory, but in terms of studying concrete analysis of people's reality, in terms of race and class, and so we're into identity politics and radical liberalism or whatever, which is untrue. I think it's
definitely. I think, there are a lot of points that I agree with you, Kayla and Carlos. I think we all agree that there is a benefit for us to all oppose imperialism, right? There's no real benefit for whether it be white workers, workers in the global South, with supporting imperialism. There's no benefit to supporting racism, right? No matter what race you are, there's no benefit to supporting patriarchy. But I want to say that it's not that there's no benefit. There is a benefit, right? If there was no benefit, then men wouldn't be patriarchal. If there was no benefit, then certain folks wouldn't support racism, right? If there was no benefit, the bourgeoisie wouldn't support this stuff. I mean, there has to be some sort of benefit. But I think I do agree on the part that anti-racism and like anti-sexism, being against the patriarchy also benefits those who claim to have an interest in it, right? So being anti-patriarchal does benefit men, right? But most men probably won't see that right away. That's the work we have to do. The same thing with anti-racism. Being anti-racist will benefit white folks. They just don't necessarily see that right away. I think we all agree on that point. I think the question that would have to be answered next then is, do people find more interest in racism, or do they have more vested interest in anti-racism? Which one will bring more interest to the individual, to certain individuals, to certain classes of people, to certain sectors of people? As a man, will I get more from supporting the patriarchy, or will I get more from not supporting the patriarchy? And I think a lot of that has to you have to consider the environment and the context, who this individual is, what kind of wealth does this individual have, where does this individual live, right? Or I already said that, but the context and the environment of this. That is what investigation in material conditions looks like. I think we should close out here. I think we can definitely do more videos on this topic. I think it'll definitely be helpful and beneficial, especially maybe even doing readings, whatever it may be. I want to give one last chance for you guys to have like some closing comments, anything else you want to say, any shout outs. One thing I do want to talk about and mention is that right now, in terms of Latin America, just to kind of steer this back, this is a little bit off topic, but steer this back into some real concrete things that are happening right now. In Ecuador, you have Yaku Perez, who recently just calls for a military coup in Quito, called for the complete destruction of the elections, and to overthrow and stop the elections. And he's saying that the February elections were fraudulent. In Honduras, you have evidence that comes out that Juan Orlando Hernandez is very, very intricate and basically very tied into the narco trafficking, something that a lot of us already knew, but now proof has come out. In Colombia, Carlos has been covering this really well with the Diaspora Tribune. They've had general strikes in Buenaventura, and now we have there was a recent bombing, if I'm correct, right, Carlos? In Buenaventura. I was at a rally the other day, a very beautiful rally with the Afro-Colombian comrade, and she was reading the names of the children who were killed by Duque in these bombings. It's pretty gross to think about killing children, and then he tries to blame them, tries to call them associates or affiliates into the radical movement. Very gross. And in Haiti, we can't forget about Haiti. We've had comrades in the ground in Haiti. And we've seen just the massive demonstrations. Those demonstrations are still continuing and still going on. So if you have the chance, please, look at all these issues that are going on, especially in Latin America, in our homelands, because these are issues that will continue to happen. And the fact that all of this is going on at one time, we have to be very aware of all of these issues and be able to fight for solidarity in all of these places. So let's remember that this is the solidarity work that we really are trying to push and do. So any closing comments from the comrades? Comrade Kayla, you could go first because Carlos talked last time.
And so, just in short, I'm going to reiterate my point that I don't think that the third worldist idea is compatible with Marxism, Leninism, but I don't think that means that gives a pass for the first world worker to be a chauvinist or dismiss the needs of other proletarians. And so when when we need to analyze our own conditions, just like Mariátegui said, he needed to analyze the conditions of Marxism, Leninism, and apply it to Peruvian conditions. We need to do the same thing because that's our job. But with our job of building socialism in the countries we are, that is in an effort to uplift the international proletarian struggle, which I see as one struggle. As the bourgeoisie thinks, they act like they have one struggle. I think that we have one struggle, whether our conditions are different. And of course, they're going to be different because of the history of what the bourgeoisie and what the capitalists have done to our homelands. And so what my vision to see is, at least in the Americas, is I want to see that Pan-Americanism, as Jose Marti writes, Nuestra America, like our America. We could uplift all of our countries and develop it together through the proletarian struggle, through proletarian internationalism. And so the answer, are white workers, are men going to see that they have more interest with the people that are left out, that don't have the benefits that they do? That's something that Cuba's still struggling with today. They're still waging it because socialism is a process, and it's not going to be one overnight. But they will get there through answering their material conditions. But we still need to fight the anti-colonial legacy and the capitalist legacy that is just like a stain that never goes away. It's a process. And I believe, as Alexandra Kollontai said, that she wrote it specifically about proletarian men and proletarian women, but that it is through the class struggle that they stop to see each other as competitors, but as allies and as comrades. And I think that is why this is one struggle, because when first world workers stop seeing themselves as needing to be parasites with the third world, they see themselves as one, as both, and together with the proletarians of the third world. When white workers stop seeing themselves as needing to be on top of black workers, they see that their struggles are together, are one, and must be united. And in unity, we are strong. Now, that doesn't give a pass to chauvinism. That doesn't give a pass to reactionaryism or reactionary views. But we can't deny that. We can't deny that it is one struggle, and we need to. I mean, that's what parties do, though. That's what, the party, at least the party I'm in, we have mass orgs. We have, we organize on our class, but we have mass orgs. We have a Latin American mass org. We have an Eastern European mass org. We have, various mass orgs. That's what the Communist Party or a Communist Party does. So it's not like that goes unaddressed. And so, I think that all of us here, we all want to see the same thing. We all want to see Latin America liberated. We want to see our people flourishing and getting the wages that they deserve, that people who work the land deserve to own it. We all want to see that. I think we just disagree on how that gets done, or how small intricacies of how the proletarian struggle should look. But at the end of the day, we all want socialism. We all want to see communism. We all want the liberation of all oppressed people here. So, just for the people watching, there's no animosity, no hate. I see Carlos as a comrade. I see him as, very someone to learn from. And I hope he sees the same about me. So we're going to continue to, work and have these discussions and come to a conclusion that we can all agree on, because I think our class and our liberation depends on it.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks,
Thank
Comrade
you.
Kayla.
Thank you,
Carlos. Yeah.
I'll echo what we've been saying all along, that even though we have differences in our ideology, I think in terms of what we want as communists is the same. We want socialism and communism all over the world. I'll stick to the fact, to my, I would say, informed opinion, that white workers, Western workers, continue to represent a layer of the global working class that is privileged, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be defeatist about it. It doesn't necessarily mean we close doors to white comrades and Western comrades, but particularly white comrades who are anti-imperialist, and not just anti-imperialist in word, but anti-imperialist in deeds, which is the most important thing. I would say that anybody interested in third worldism to read up on Marxist academics like Zach Cope, like John Smith, Imperialism in the 21st Century, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Tony Norfield's The City, and other, third worldists. Rui, for us Latin Americans, Rui Mauro Marini is a very important third worldist thinker. Well, more particularly, he's known as the Marxist dependency theory, one of the founders of Marxist dependency theory. And then I also want to, highlight that we have these theoretical discussions and these conversations and stuff which are important. But the most important thing that Anticonquista does is collect money, collect funds to send back home to our comrades, our socialist comrades back home. We, in the last 3-4 years of our existence, we've sent tens of thousands of dollars to Latin America and the Caribbean. We've also recently created a organization particularly for the Colombian struggle called Red Condor Collective, and with them we've raised over $10,000 to send back home to socialist movements there. So this just to highlight that
we have this theoretical discussions, but we're not armchair revolutionaries. We see the collecting of funds, material support for revolutionaries in the homeland as our action. So yeah, I would encourage anybody who's interested, if you're a third worldist, or if you're any other type of communist, or even any other type of leftist or liberal or whatever political persuasion, to help Anticonquista in our work that we do with the transformation of society in mind. We don't do it to get big on YouTube or to be big personalities on Twitter and so on. We do it because we have an actual care, an actual we want to invest our energies in the revolution, and we think this that's the way to do it. So I'd encourage people to go to our Patreon, subscribe, and also look up for GoFundMe when we campaign for them. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Yes, comrades. And that's the other thing too. We want to plug our fundraising. Fundraising is such an important part of what we do at Anticonquista. This content, none of us get paid for this work. We all have jobs or in school or in doing working with other organizations, mutual aid, other parties, whatever it may be. So we're very busy in our daily lives, and we take the time out to do this work. And it's none of it goes to us. It all goes to the people of Latin America, back in our homelands, to our ancestors. And that's why it's so important for us to get the funding and raising that we can here in the United States and the UK and really all throughout the world. I'm going to end with some words from Walter Rodney, some of the words we started with. Hope all y'all had enjoyed this discussion, had a good time, learned some things, dive deeper into the discussion, investigate more, draw your own opinions. These are just our opinions. You don't have to believe everything. We're not God. This isn't the Bible. We're not writing the New Testament here. So, please do your own investigations and learn more. Peace. Venceremos, comrades. Let's listen to Walter Rodney.
Social forces all over the world enter into the making of the products which are sent out by capitalism. And yet it has never been more private in its appropriation. Never has so much wealth been concentrated in so few hands in a system that has been globalized in its social content. And these contradictions emerge, first of all, in the center where capital resides, where capital concentrates, and they are then exported to the rest of the third world, to the rest of the world. We only need to look at the principal indices of the crisis. 1, the rate of inflation. 2, the degree of unemployment. And 3, the instability of major international currencies. And you see how in each of these instances, the crisis, however great it may be, in Britain or in Germany or in the United States, is far less than the extent of the crisis in Africa and the Caribbean. That's for sure. And the central capitalist countries have some mechanisms for dealing with the problem. They establish priorities, they pass legislation, they take steps to try and cope with the 3 problems I've mentioned. Whereas in our economies, there is nothing but laissez-faire, because there is no power locally resident in the African and Caribbean economies to cope with these major problems. Inflation, which obviously runs at a high rate here, which is really not being curbed in any of the major capitalist countries, not even in Japan or in West Germany, is something which, when exported to the third world, means far more than it does here. Partly because the margin for survival in the third world is often so slim, and partly because of the lack of control over our indigenous economies.